A tumultuous childhood in California. Dorothea Puente's earliest days could have come straight from a Depression-era tragedy, only darker. Born Dorothea Helen Gray on a cold January day in 1929, right in Redlands, California, she was the sixth of 7 children, a family that was already gasping for air before she even came along. The Grays clung together in a battered shack where hunger was an expected guest, and laughter rarely visited. Her father, Trudy, was a cotton picker by trade and already weakened when Dorothea entered the world. Tragedy tugged at her from the start. At age 8, tuberculosis claimed her father's life, leaving the household adrift. But things only worsened. Her mother, an alcoholic and a seamstress by turns, was notorious in their little town. She was known to vanish for days, sometimes weeks, in pursuit of the kind of solace only found at the bottom of a bottle. Her anger was legendary and cruel, snapping at her children with fists, belts, or whatever came to hand. Neighbors learned to ignore the cries from the Grays' squat house, figuring it wasn't their business. Dorothea's older siblings did their best to shield her, but they were still children, trapped themselves in a cycle of poverty and neglect. At age 10, Dorothea's world collapsed again as her mother died violently in a car accident under the cloud of another drunken night. Orphaned now in every sense, the Gray children scattered into the wind. Dorothea was shuffled through a string of foster homes and orphanages, institutions that bore little resemblance to what most people would call a home. There was no privacy, no comfort, and often no protection from abuse. Young Dorothea, thin and wide-eyed, learned early that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. In those years, she would later allege to have suffered physical and sexual abuse at the hands of adults meant to care for her. No one came to her defense. This planted something hard and cold inside her, a dark sense that the world was a brutal place, and survival meant hardening your heart. By her early teens, Dorothea had seen enough violence and chaos to last a lifetime. In California's sun-drenched towns, her life played out in the shadows. School was a rare luxury, friends even rarer. She flitted between foster parents and group homes, a ghost of a girl nobody really wanted. The state's social systems were overrun, underfunded, and blind to the tragedies piling up behind closed doors. Dorothea became fiercely independent, haunted, and above all, resourceful. What others called manipulation, she called survival. Beneath the Californian blue sky and orange groves, her wounds grew. Each season hammered her spirit further, sculpting a silent, distrustful teenager determined never to be powerless again. And therein lay the seed of the woman she would become. A woman who could disappear behind masks, tell any story, and do whatever it took to escape the pain of her earliest years. The turning point at 1616 hit Dorothea like an unexpected storm rolling in from the Pacific. Swift, unkind, and impossible to ignore. While most kids at that age might worry about prom dresses or who'd take them to the dance, Dorothea was already on her own, navigating the urban wilds of California with nothing but her instincts and a stubborn will to survive. The state's foster system had taught her one cruel lesson: you couldn't depend on anyone but yourself. Hunger, mistrust, and the sting of loneliness were constant companions. She had learned to keep her head down, to stay out of trouble when she could, and to move quietly between shelters, tenement houses, and the occasional hard cot of a stranger's kindness. But the world wasn't gentle for a young woman without roots or protection. Opportunities for honest work were slim, and often given to those with brighter smiles or lighter pasts. For girls like Dorothea, haunted, thin, and carrying invisible scars, the path was narrower still. That year, desperation finally tightened its grip. At just 16, Dorothea took her first steps into the world of prostitution. It was a choice that didn't feel like a choice at all. Each night the city's neon lights would flicker along tired avenues, marking the corners where lost souls bartered whatever they had left. Sometimes Dorothea would catch her reflection in a rain-speckled window and barely recognize the cautious, calculating girl staring back. But in the loneliness and danger of those empty streets, Dorothea found the strange power that came with being needed, even if only for a moment. Men came and went, always older, sometimes menacing, sometimes sad. Soon Dorothea learned to read people in seconds, to spot kindness or cruelty in a glance, to twist words just enough to bargain for her safety, to make herself invisible if the vibe turned wrong. She was tough, clever, and determined to outlast the city that had chewed up so many others just like her. It was in these rough-edged years that she met Fred McFall, a World War II veteran carrying his own share of damage. He was older, steady-seeming, and for a moment Dorothea glimpsed something resembling stability. Their marriage was quick, and at first, heavy with hope. a shot at family, at anchoring herself to something sturdy. It wasn't a fairy tale, neither of them had the script for that. They had 2 children in rapid succession, but for Dorothea, maternal instincts were dulled by trauma and a restless spirit. She made the agonizing decision to give them up for adoption. Another wound, another secret. The marriage stumbled under the weight of unspoken pain. Old ghosts hovered in every room, and soon enough, the cracks became chasms. In 1948, not long after her 19th birthday, Dorothea and Fred went their separate ways, closing the chapter on her first real attempt at family. Alone once more, Dorothea walked into her future with nothing but a battered heart and a name that would in time come to haunt Sacramento's darkest memories. Broken vows and the first brush with the law. By the time Dorothea was no longer just a girl scraping by on the streets of California, she had learned to view every relationship like a potential lifeboat, something to cling to, even if it was splintered and leaking. The promise of family, companionship, and safety was intoxicating, but Dorothea's haunted past always seemed to taint every new beginning. Her first marriage to Fred McFall was hastily arranged, forged from shared loneliness rather than love. Fred, a weary World War II veteran, was looking for an anchor in a drifting world, and Dorothea, just 16, mistook his steadiness for sanctuary. They tried to build a life. 2 children came quickly, but trauma dulled Dorothea's sense of maternal belonging. The echoes of her own childhood neglect and abuse haunted her, making the idea of caring for someone else unbearably heavy. Within just a few years, Dorothea made the gut-wrenching decision to give both her children up for adoption, a scar that would quietly fester for decades. The end of her first marriage was just the beginning of a calamitous pattern. Dorothea drifted into a string of relationships and marriages, each more volatile than the last. Sometimes she changed her name, hoping a new identity could erase the past. She became Dorothea Puente, among other aliases, and in every town she landed, she'd concoct another version of herself, sometimes a widow, sometimes a nurse, sometimes just a lost soul in need of a fresh start. The bonds she formed were never built on trust. Her partners, sensing the shadows within her, often responded with jealousy, manipulation, or violence. One marriage ended in only a few months, dissolved by court order amid allegations of infidelity and cruelty. Another man, on discovering Dorothea's criminal record, abandoned her almost overnight, leaving her with nothing but a suitcase and a jaded heart. She knew how to lie, and how to play the victim, but genuine connection always eluded her. As emotional turmoil churned beneath the surface, Dorothea's means of survival grew increasingly desperate. Poverty drove her to petty crimes, writing bad checks, forging signatures, dipping in and out of trouble with the law. Sacramento police officers knew her name, and the local jails gave her a strange sense of routine. In 1960, she spent 4 months behind bars for trying to pass a forged check. Not long after, another charge, this time for working in a brothel, landed her 90 more days behind bars. Each time the return to freedom was more daunting than before, each sentence another chip at her sense of hope. Through these failures, Dorothea honed the ability to hide her pain behind practiced smiles and polite conversation. To neighbors, she was sometimes seen as unlucky, sometimes as trouble, and sometimes just invisible. The revolving door of failed marriages and mounting arrests were reminders that the world was never gentle with girls like Dorothea Gray or Puente or whatever name she wore that week. And as her trust in others crumbled, so did her faith in rules and consequences. The law, family, love, all of it to Dorothea, became as fragile and disposable as the identities she shed. But what she hadn't lost was her survival instinct, and it was about to manifest in ways that no one in Sacramento was prepared for. The first in, and the unfortunate prey. Dorothea's knack for slipping into new roles found its stage in the gritty underbelly of 1970s Sacramento. After years drifting in and out of trouble, each bad check and failed marriage blurring the boundaries between right and wrong, she finally discovered a way to exist that was both legal and deeply unsupervised, opening her first boarding house. On the surface, it was a stroke of benevolence. The advertising was simple and straightforward, a clean place to sleep for those the rest of the world had discarded. Elderly men and women, people with disabilities, the homeless, the lonely, the dying. Sacramento's forgotten streamed in, clutching their last social security checks, eager for a hot meal, a bed, and maybe a smile. This small plot of California promised dignity, but behind closed doors, Dorothea was always calculating. Outwardly, she was disarmingly kind, sometimes rounding up extra blankets, fussing over bruised shins, offering cups of tea. The guests came to call her Mama, and she let them, playing the part of caretaker so convincingly that even city officials would look the other way at her lack of permits. She paid attention to the little things, remembering anniversaries, holding trembling hands late at night, always there with a gentle touch or a soft word. Dorothea learned every vulnerability, every secret wish, every forgotten hope. She measured her guests the way a butcher weighs cuts of meat. The house began to fill up not just with the smell of boiled potatoes but with secrets. Men disappeared slowly, sometimes after a mysterious trip to the doctor arranged by Dorothea, sometimes after a sudden turn in health that puzzled local paramedics. No one in the neighborhood noticed. People slipped away so quietly in this part of town that even when a chair at the communal dinner table sat empty day after day, few bothered to ask questions. She managed the loneliness in her guests with hollow kindness, never genuine enough to risk her interests, but always just believable enough to disarm suspicion. But as Dorothea learned to siphon off their government checks, a little here, a little there, forging signatures and updating paperwork, her fate began to twist. When one suspicious family member called the police after repeated attempts to contact a missing relative, the question started. Dorothea's charm, so effective on the frail and overlooked, began to fray under pressure. She was arrested for theft, and her carefully constructed world collapsed, at least for a while. The judge's gavel gave her 5 years of probation. She dodged real jail time, but her first boarding house was gone. Still, Dorothea left no one in doubt. She'd discovered a powerful truth. In a world where nobody wants the burden of society's leftovers, the one who pretends to care can get away with almost anything. Image of a graceful angel. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was meticulously crafted, bit by bit, like a costume sewn to fit so perfectly no one would ever suspect the darkness hiding beneath. By the end of the 1970s, Dorothea Puente was tired of her reputation, her criminal record, and the relentless suspicion that seemed to follow her through every cheap rental and low-end job in Sacramento. She knew that if she was going to survive, and thrive, she had to become someone new, someone people would trust feeling safe around. She studied the world with a predator's patience, watching which types of women drew admiration and which ones drew skepticism. Gone were the flashy outfits of her younger years, the garish makeup and brash demeanor she'd cultivated to shield her vulnerability. Instead, she invested in a new wardrobe, demure dresses in soft colors, sensible shoes, and a collection of thick, rounded glasses. She let her naturally graying hair grow into a neat, practical style, and toned down every aspect of her presence until she faded neatly into the background of polite company. She perfected a warm, grandmotherly smile, gentle, apologetic, harmless. The real secret was her command of empathy, or at least the appearance of it. Dorothea understood loneliness all too well, and she knew the precise tone to use when addressing the lost and the frail. Her home on F Street was soon known for the fresh potted plants placed around the porch, lace curtains always pulled aside just enough to let the sunshine in, and the faint aroma of baking bread drifting from the kitchen. Neighbors began referring to her as Miss Dottie, the charitable old lady who loved to open her door for Sacramento's forgotten souls. Anyone walking by would see her tending the garden or sitting on her creaky front steps with a cup of tea, gently inquiring about the well-being of those passing by. Inside the house, her manners were impeccable. She insisted on politeness at the table, no raised voices, always say grace before meals, eat together if you could. She made a point of remembering birthdays and favorite meals, offering up small, personalized acts of kindness that almost felt like mothering. Damaged people flocked to her, former inmates, alcoholic veterans, disabled souls, the elderly with no family left, all of them adrift on the tides of a city uninterested in their fate. And in Dorothea, they found warmth where before there had only been the cold unpredictability of shelters or the streets. But even as she cultivated this new morality play for the neighborhood, Dorothea's true motivations remained unchanged. The surface was serene, almost saintly, but beneath it she was always calculating. She fostered trust, not because she believed in redemption or community, but because trust made people vulnerable. She didn't need brute force to get what she wanted, she needed faith. She spoke in soft tones of acceptance and love, learning the details of her tenants' lives, where they kept their checkbooks, what medications they took, who might check up on them, and when. She offered herself as a Social Security payee or a helper at the bank, all for their convenience. It didn't take long for her past to find cracks in this new facade. There were days when the anxiety would mount. Someone from her former life recognizing her at the post office, or a neighbor lingering too long with questions about where so-and-so had gone. But her act never slipped. If confronted, she'd say, "Oh, he got better and moved out," or "Her son finally came for her," always with a sigh and a small, performative sadness in her eyes. In the early 80s, she took her charade a step further by seeking out patients from hospitals and local shelters, not just renting rooms but advertising herself as an amateur nurse. She even volunteered with local charities for a time, skillfully blending philanthropy with her quietly manipulative brand of care. The trick, Dorothea learned, was not to appear too eager for money. Instead, she let the city's underbelly come to her. Word spread that her boarding house was a haven for people who had nowhere left to go. Behind closed doors, she tightened her control in subtle ways. Tenants were often heavily medicated, sometimes with prescriptions she arranged, sometimes from her own mysterious stockpile. On bad days, several would be seen dozing off mid-conversation, faces slack and arms limp at their sides. When questioned, Dorothea was always ready with an explanation. They had trouble sleeping, their conditions were worsening, or a different doctor had prescribed new pills. She assured relatives, caseworkers, and social services that she was closely monitoring everything for their best interests. By now, her reputation as a caregiver was entrenched. Caseworkers and outreach staff, overworked and desperate to place their most difficult cases somewhere stable, were grateful to have someone like Dorothea absorbing the overflow. They barely noticed as a few tenants stopped showing up at mealtimes, or as their mail stopped being collected in the front hallway. If pressed, Dorothea could produce a signature from the missing tenant, sometimes forged, sometimes coerced, and always offered to forward their benefits checks to the appropriate new address. In truth, she was cashing nearly all of them herself. Her skill for manipulation grew sharper each month. She rehearsed her stories, mastered the paperwork, and predicted almost every possible question that might come her way. She was careful to never take on tenants who had frequent visitors or family nearby. The ones chosen for her care were almost always alone, their correspondence drying up or already lost to the state's apathy long before they entered her orbit. That was how she preferred it. Easy to control, easy to erase. Dorothea also developed a ritual of sorts for those final days. She'd bring a tenant their food in bed, urging them to rest, to let her look after everything. Sometimes she'd sit with them for hours, murmuring soft reassurances, hand cool and steady, never flinching. She was patient. There was no need to rush. When it was over, she carried out the practical steps herself, disposing of belongings, claiming benefits, quietly informing neighbors or caseworkers that the tenant had moved on. The myth of the nurturing angel of F Street only grew as the years wore on, even after a few incidents. Whispers of residents falling ill, sudden departures. Suspicion never seemed to stick. There was something so reassuring about her shape, hunched over a crossword in the living room, or the sound of her gentle voice drifting down the corridor. Few could imagine evil so mundane, evil that tucked you in at night and made sure your glass of water was always full. All the while, Dorothea stayed vigilant. She knew just how thin the ice was beneath her feet. She kept meticulous notes, not just financial ledgers but lists of excuses and alibis, every story she'd told to every person. The duplicity was exhausting, but she relished the power it gave her. People loved Miss Dottie, and for a time that was all the protection she needed. In the harsh world of Sacramento's shadows, the most dangerous predator was the one wearing sensible shoes, pouring you a cup of tea, and promising you a brand new start. The return of the deathly grandmother. Following her early release in 1985 due to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, Dorothea Puente's return to the streets of Sacramento was oddly quiet, almost spectral. She moved with the careful grace of someone who understood that every neighborly wave and polite nod could be the difference between suspicion and acceptance. For most ex-cons, the world at large held a mirror to their failures, but not Dorothea. If anything, prison had only sharpened her performance. She resurfaced at 1426 F Street, reopening her infamous boarding house under a new veil of benevolence, marketing it as a modest sanctuary for the city's invisible souls. Sacramento in the mid-1980s was a city in flux, a place where the vulnerable lived alongside the comfortable yet rarely crossed paths. The social safety nets were threadbare, and the community shelters stretched past capacity. Against this backdrop, Dorothea's home seemed like an answer. She targeted the elderly, the disabled, and those surviving on thin slices of government welfare, individuals abandoned by family or battered by decades on the margins. She'd approach caseworkers and hospital staff with her unassuming smile, offering beds for those no one else would take. They were grateful, relieved to check a name off a long waiting list. Yet behind the soft-lit windows, her methods had only grown slicker. She drafted contracts for new tenants, securing herself as a primary payee for Social Security checks. Her promises always came with caveats: how the finances would be safe in her hands, how the boarders needn't trouble themselves about bills or food or medical appointments. "Let your money rest. I'll handle everything," she'd say with a practiced gentleness. What she craved wasn't just money, but control, the kind that only total dependence can give. Inside the Victorian house, the facade of warmth was meticulously maintained. Chintz curtains fluttered on the breeze. The aroma of stewing meat and bread wafted through every hallway. Dorothea, clad in pastel cardigans and sturdy shoes, flitted from room to room checking on her charges, adjusting pillows, ensuring medication was swallowed, sometimes with a watchful intensity that left even the most compliant tenants nervous. She was the model caregiver, patient, witty, ever so strict about the house's rules. No smoking, no cursing, meals at the same hour each day. But beneath that layer of orderliness pulsed an undercurrent of calculation. She scouted every new arrival for vulnerabilities. Who sent the mail? Who had visitors? Who had a pension check or a disability stipend she could quietly reroute to herself? Caseworkers came and went in the mid-afternoon, often announcing their visits in advance, and Dorothea would stage her home accordingly. If someone had been sleeping more than usual, she'd report a downturn in their condition. If a tenant vanished, she was mournful, but navigated the paperwork with brisk efficiency. "Their niece called and they've gone down south," she'd explain, voice thick with sorrow she'd rehearsed in the mirror. Even the sharpest social workers rarely questioned her explanations. She thrived in the cracks between bureaucratic indifference and genuine community, becoming both a ghost and a fixture. As the months rolled on, her home filled with souls whose stories had all begun to sound the same. Lost jobs, broken family ties, a last chance at dignity in twilight years. They expected little. Some had lived through the Great Depression, others through decades of mental health struggles. Most, like Dorothea herself, understood what it meant to be overlooked. In them she saw tools rather than people, a means to grasp the financial stability she'd always been denied. The neighborhood, meanwhile, grew accustomed to her ways. She'd host informal tea parties on the porch, pouring cups for passing postmen or curious teenagers. For Halloween, she'd hand out store-bought candy to children, always remembering the names of the parents. The local grocery manager knew her by sight, and the pharmacist behind the counter would sometimes set aside a bottle of medication for her in advance. Her reliability, her steadiness, these things became armor. It was part performance, part genuine survival. In a city of strangers, rapport was currency. And then, there were the other boarders. The men and women shuffled between group homes, clinics, and the odd motel. In Dorothea's house, each was monitored, managed, and at times medicated beyond reason. If someone disobeyed the rules, they'd find themselves isolated, moved to a smaller room, denied phone calls or visits. She wielded psychological pressure as deftly as any prescription, her concern always tinged with threat. "You wouldn't want to lose your place here, would you?" To the outside world, her reputation as a force for good only grew. She submitted herself for social service directories as a model care provider. Clergy and volunteers sometimes dropped by, offering donations for the tenants, a sack of flour, an extra blanket, a kind word. Dorothea always accepted with gratitude, but the flow of strangers through the house meant no one ever became too familiar with its regulars. Sometimes the boarders simply disappeared. Most had little family to notify, and if a caseworker asked too many questions, Dorothea would present a handwritten note, sometimes forged, sometimes coerced, insisting the tenant had left voluntarily. Meanwhile, she'd inventory their possessions, cash their checks, and occasionally empty their rooms in the dead of night. As the city's neediest cycled through her home, her network of stories and justifications thickened, each a fresh layer of camouflage for the predator within. Yet even as Dorothea perfected her charade, she could never truly silence the ghosts she cultivated. There were whispers among former tenants and occasional workers. People mentioned medications that made them groggy, sudden personality changes, or simply falling out of touch without warning. Other tenants, too frightened or dependent to complain, kept their heads down and repeated the house rules as if reciting a prayer. But the city's agencies were ill-equipped to notice the shadows. Overworked caseworkers barely glanced up from their paperwork. Police responded only when explicitly summoned. As long as Dorothea's home didn't draw attention, she remained invisible. A grandmotherly figure gliding through the margins of Sacramento, helping those no one else would claim. She meticulously recorded every transaction, every name, every fabricated story in matching ledgers kept in a locked back room. At night she would sometimes sit in her small parlor, running her fingers over the columns of numbers and addresses, quietly murmuring the names of those who had moved on. Her satisfaction came not from violence but from the certainty that she was at last untouchable. The world she manipulated obeyed her now, every shadow and absent tenant another mark of her cunning. Still, she could not help but feel a thrum of anxiety whenever the doorbell chimed unexpectedly or a patrol car rolled past. She'd practice explanations for each possible inquiry. How she would explain the missing, the dead, the increasingly foggy residents upstairs. Her performance was not just for neighbors, but for herself, a daily rehearsal for a play she hoped would never end. And so the deathly grandmother continued, blending compassion and coercion until the two were indistinguishable. Sacramento's lost souls came through her doors, and most never questioned the soft hand that guided them to their fate. In Dorothea's house, routine was smokescreen, kindness was camouflage, and the true cost of care was seen only by those who vanished in her embrace. Angel or devil? From the moment Dorothea Puente's doors opened, Sacramento whispered about whose side she was truly on. Was she the selfless angel of F Street or something far more sinister lurking behind a grandmotherly smile? For every neighbor who praised her compassion, pouring coffee with steady hands for caseworkers and socialites alike, another would later recall a chill in their spine, a sense that beneath Dorothea's careful curtsies and gentle questions pulsed a hidden threat. To outsiders, Dorothea crafted an almost holy routine. Mornings began with the kettle whistling and the smell of cinnamon rolls winding through the house. Residents shuffled in for breakfast, greeted individually by name, their favorite mug already set out by a woman who seemed to recall everyone's allergies and stories. She led Thanksgiving charities and donated to church raffles. She sent cards to families of past boarders, spinning tales of their happiness in some far-flung state. On the surface, she was the beating heart of a home for the forgotten. Yet, for those unlucky enough to live beneath her roof, there was a complexity to Dorothea's care. The affection never came free. A boarder might wake from nap after nap with wobbly legs and a foggy mind, wondering if the little white pills in their evening cocoa were really for pain, or simply for Dorothea's convenience. Bills and Social Security checks disappeared almost as quickly as the new tenants arrived. Sometimes possessions would be cataloged and boxed even before a resident decided to move. There, in the tension between charity and carefully disguised predation, lay Dorothea's real gift. She knew exactly whose wounds to bandage, whose loneliness to fill, and whose story could be used as cover for her own schemes. The city's most vulnerable didn't always know how to speak up. Depression, illness, and faded memories made easy cover for mistakes or mishaps reported by Miss Dottie. When a tenant vanished, she would explain it away with a sorrowful shake of her head. His brother in Oregon finally wrote back, came and picked him up, she'd murmur, patting a new guest's hand with rehearsed reassurance. These folks don't always say goodbye, dear. What few realized was that goodbye in Dorothea's world rarely meant a happy ending. She engineered disappearances with almost administrative precision, records updated, beds remade, stories rehearsed until caseworkers, neighbors, and postal clerks parroted her words as gospel. The sense of routine was intoxicating to observers. Every black mark vanished in an ocean of small routine goodness. Who would dare question the pleasant old lady with the tidy garden and the open-door policy? Yet the veneer of normalcy was also her greatest camouflage. One social worker later reflected, "You want to believe there are people out there like Dorothea, the kind that care enough to pick up the slack when the system fails. So you miss the warning signs. You choose the miracle over the monster." She was not just a product of her time, but an expert at reading the myths a community needed, and slipping into the role just so. But there were moments her mask slipped, if only for a heartbeat. Occasionally a guest would notice her voice harden for a second when her authority was questioned. "This is my house!" she'd hiss, but recover instantly with a grandmother's laugh. Others remembered how, late at night, she would linger by the mailbox or telephone, always watching, always alert. She manipulated not only social safety nets but human trust itself, sowing doubt as easily as she baked bread. The duality of Dorothea's existence gnawed at those who came to know her. To some survivors and neighbors, she remains a confusing ghost, someone who shared their grief and lent them a jacket in the rain, even as she hid secrets beneath the petunias and the concrete. To others, she was the purest kind of predator, one who let her victims believe they were safe right up to the bitter end. As the years passed, more went missing, and each departure was papered over with ever more elaborate stories. It wasn't just the lonely and ill who fell under her spell. Even seemingly street-smart social service workers, seasoned police, and skeptical nurses found themselves lulled by her patience, her unhurried answers, and her consistency. She knew that in a city pulsing with distraction and need, a comforting face and a hot meal were all it took to earn blind trust. Still, even as her reputation swelled and the neighborhood leaned more heavily on her, there were whispers. An occasional tenant would send a frantic letter to a distant relative. A nurse would suggest a boarder needed less medication, not more, money missing from envelopes, all brushed away as complications of old age or poverty, never ever laid at Dorothea's tidy doorstep. Dorothea understood the need people had to see the best in others. She exploited it ruthlessly, using empathy as both weapon and cloak. To the lost and abandoned, she was the answer to unspoken prayers. To herself, she was always the survivor, one step ahead, holding on tight to the narrative that kept her safe. So, angel or demon, for the city it took years, and more tragedy than anyone cared to believe in, to finally see through the haze of goodwill and discover the evil meticulously disguised as grace. But by then, for so many, the question was heartbreakingly too late. The turning point. The Bert Montoya case. In the quiet margins of Sacramento's bustling streets, Bert Montoya was barely a whisper, a man whose existence flickered in and out of focus for most people. He was mentally challenged, with a childlike innocence and a trusting smile that never quite faded, even when the world treated him roughly. For Dorothea Puente, though, Bert was more than just another vulnerable tenant. He became the unknowing catalyst for her eventual downfall, a thread that, once pulled, unraveled everything. Bert's story with Dorothea began the way so many others had. After years of bouncing between shelters and group homes, he was referred to her by a local outreach worker, desperate to find stable housing for a client who struggled to care for himself. Dorothea, ever the gracious hostess, welcomed Bert with her well-practiced warmth. She called him "my special boy," telling caseworkers and charity staff how she'd take extra care of him, as if she were his guardian angel. Her house on F Street had the faint aroma of fresh bread and the comforting clutter of potted plants, very little to raise suspicion, especially to an overworked system constantly on the lookout for miracles. For Bert, the days in Dorothea's boarding house were initially peaceful. He liked the routine. She always remembered what he liked for breakfast, let him tend her small garden, and was quick with gentle reminders to take his medication. It was, by all outward appearances, the stability he needed. Visitors, including case managers and volunteers, saw Bert clean and well-fed. He even began to open up a little, his anxious stutter fading as trust took root. But behind closed doors, Dorothea's patience could quickly sour, especially if Bert became confused or difficult. Her soft voice would harden, her grip on his welfare checks, her control over every aspect of his life would become absolute. Unlike many of her other tenants, Bert had at least one constant visitor, his social worker, Judy Moyse. Judy's years of experience with the city's most vulnerable made her both cautious and quietly skeptical, and she kept close tabs on Bert despite the reassuring reports Dorothea always provided. For a while, Judy let herself be placated. After all, the system was full of horror stories, and the home on F Street with its flowers and lace curtains seemed almost idyllic by comparison. But Bert's presence in the neighborhood was distinctive. He would wave to passers-by, repeat details of his life to anyone willing to listen, and cling to predictable habits. Visiting the corner store for soda, picking flowers from the front yard, chasing after stray cats. When, over the course of several days, neighbors and shopkeepers realized that Bert was absent, an uneasy silence settled in. It was easy to blame the fluid nature of boarding house tenants. People left, relapsed, found jobs, vanished from the city's radar all the time. But something felt different about Bert's disappearance. He hadn't collected his social security check and his beloved garden lay untended. Judy was the first to raise the alarm. She phoned Dorothea, who responded with practiced concern. "Bert isn't feeling well," she explained. "He's resting a lot. New medication, you see. I'm keeping a close eye on him." The explanation could have sufficed. Many of Judy's clients cycled through episodes of illness requiring days of rest. But the following week, When she attempted a drop-in visit, Dorothea blocked her at the door, insisting Bert was too sick to see visitors. Suspicion gnawed at Judy, but Dorothea's answers were consistent, and she produced a note, allegedly written by Bert himself, stating he was fine and didn't want to be disturbed. Still, Judy was not the only one uneased by Bert's vanishing. Other tenants, those who hadn't yet learned the cost of speaking out, began to murmur amongst themselves. They recalled the sudden departures that had become so commonplace in Dorothea's house, the stringent house rules, and the disorienting effect of medications. Some claimed to have heard Bert calling out at odd hours, others mentioned seeing Dorothea in the garden late at night, digging or pouring concrete for what she said were new planters. A few of the more lucid residents tried to contact Bert's friends at the outreach center, but the confusion of the house, the haze of drugs, and the fear of retribution often drowned out their weak voices. Judy, however, refused to let the matter drop. She began to keep detailed notes and pressed the local authorities to conduct a welfare check. They arrived at Dorothea's boarding house and found nothing obviously amiss, save for Bert's conspicuous absence. Questions were met with sympathy and tales of recovery. His family in Mexico sent for him. He's gone to join them. Dorothea's eyes shimmered with well-practiced tears. This explanation, again, almost worked. But the web of lies began to unravel when another tenant covertly handed Judy a note, one scrawled in shaky, frantic handwriting, denying that Bert had ever left the house. This evidence, combined with mounting testimony from worried neighbors and frontline workers, finally broke through the wall of quiet complicity that had shielded Dorothea for so long. Police returned with more pointed questions. This time Dorothea's answers faltered, her legendary composure showing cracks. She couldn't explain away the contradictions in her stories, the missing checks, the late-night sounds from the backyard. When officers asked for permission to search the premises, Dorothea hesitated but eventually relented, retreating behind her carefully maintained facade as they scoured the house and garden. Their search would soon unearth something that neither they nor anyone in Sacramento could have imagined, a gruesome tableau that made Bert Montoya's disappearance not an isolated tragedy, but the lever that toppled everything Dorothea had so masterfully built. The ghostly quiet that had surrounded Bert's final days was finally shattered, and with it, the illusion of the angelic caretaker at 1426 F Street was gone forever. Shocking truth. Beneath the concrete, the chilling discovery at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. The days leading up to the ultimate unmasking of Dorothea Puente's hidden crimes were marked by a tension that seemed to thicken the very air around her unassuming Victorian home. The authorities, now alerted by both missing person reports and frantic whispers from bartenders, caseworkers, and fearful former tenants, found themselves circling the enigmatic presence at 1426 F Street. Sacramento was a city used to pain and shadows, but nothing could have prepared even the most hardened investigators for what they were about to unearth beneath Dorothea's carefully manicured garden beds. It began, like so many of the horrors surrounding Puente, with a strange contradiction, a homey facade masking the strange, almost ritualistic comings and goings. The residents upstairs became taciturn, pallid, and in some cases simply stopped being seen at all by neighbors who once exchanged small talk by the picket fence. Rumors swirled about nighttime activity in the backyard, Dorothea allegedly seen shoveling or having men pour concrete patches late at night. Yet in the daylight the house radiated a sedate normalcy, with Dorothea offering hand-baked scones and tea to anyone who looked her way. Inside the house, officers were struck by the chilling contrast: shelves lined with porcelain figurines and crocheted blankets, a perpetual pot of stew bubbling on the stove, and a host whose measured voice never once quivered. Dorothea insisted with all the steadfastness of someone who had practiced her lines for decades that her tenants had simply moved on, gone to live with distant relatives or checked themselves into new care homes. She furnished notes in stunted handwriting, produced addresses of dubious authenticity, and offered resigned sighs at each persistent question. But it was the physical evidence that finally shifted the inquiry from suspicion to certainty. During a routine welfare check, suspicion blossomed anew when a tenant secretly slipped a detective a frantic note, "Please dig in the yard, she is not what she seems." That single sentence crackled like a live wire through the whole investigation. Armed with a warrant and a growing sense of urgency, authorities converged on the property on a cold November morning, their boots sinking into the damp earth of Dorothea's yard as they prepared to dig for the truth. Even in those first few moments, investigators expected perhaps a shallow grave, one body, maybe two. What they encountered instead was a tableau of horror and calculation long hidden in the shadows of domestic tranquility, with shovels striking first upon loose, newly turned earth beneath a cement slab, then on further patches of hurriedly poured concrete. The grim reality unfolded. Layer by layer remains were unearthed. First one, then another, each body showing signs of deliberate concealment and advanced decomposition. The sickly sweet aroma of decay filled the air, mixing incongruously with Dorothea's garden rosemary and the ever-present scent of cinnamon from her kitchen. One by one the bodies were tagged, photographed, and carefully removed for forensic investigation, 7 in total from beneath the garden and the concrete patio. Investigators were horrified by the systematic nature of the burials. Bodies were found carefully wrapped, sometimes interlaced with sheets or plastic tarps, and in some instances weighted down with everyday items from the boarding house itself, discarded bed frames, broken tiles, bags of concrete mix. Medical examiners would later confirm the victims died either through overmedication, chemical restraint, or outright suffocation. The work of a mind chillingly methodical in its efficiency. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and TV news crews flocked to the once quiet street, capturing the parade of evidence bags and stretchers. Dorothea maintained a brittle, performative calm, offering weary protestations. "They must have been here before I moved in," she claimed, or "I only tried to help them." It was a performance that fooled fewer and fewer with every shovel load unearthed from the cursed backyard. The case quickly made national headlines, dubbed by the media as the death house on F Street. For the detectives, the puzzle was as much logistical as psychological. Every missing tenant required identification. Every check cashed in their name needed tracing. A web of stolen identities and collected benefits dating back years. Interviews with surviving former boarders and house helpers painted a harrowing picture. Midnight orders to dig holes, the odd job she hired local transients to undertake, instructions never to ask questions, or to repeat, "He moved out last weekend," if anyone came knocking. And then there were the small details that chilled even the most stoic officers. A child's photo wedged behind a loose floorboard, a faded birthday card signed by a tenant who had vanished years prior, rows of social security checks never claimed by their rightful owners. Every artifact was a thread in the dark tapestry Dorothea had woven under everyone's nose. For the city and the nation, the case was both sensational and profoundly tragic. Here was a woman who had played the grandmother, the caretaker, and the social benefactor, who baked pies for church fundraisers and hosted holiday dinners, now revealed as perhaps the most cold-blooded criminal Sacramento had ever known. The image of evil itself had shifted, not a figure of violent rage, but of serene duplicity, her crimes hidden in plain sight and tucked beneath peonies and rose bushes. As the investigations deepened, the procedural work became relentless. Police worked late into the night matching dental records, combing through property ledgers and cross-referencing years of missing persons files, often running into bureaucratic dead ends where the system's neglect dovetailed perfectly with Dorothea's design. This was not the story of isolated violence but a sprawling history of overlooked suffering, victims so forgotten by society that their sudden disappearances barely triggered a ripple, their last earthly resting place a patch of concrete in a perfumed garden. Reporters interwove stories of grief from faraway children and long-lost relatives, some of whom had spent years convinced their parent or sibling had simply wandered off, not knowing they were buried just yards from where the city trolley line rattled by. Psychologists and true crime pundits descended on Sacramento, parsing Dorothea's every expression in the courtroom, dissecting what could possess a person to commit such methodical evil while maintaining such a perfect mask. But for those left picking up the pieces, the survivors, detectives, and even some of the neighbors who once trusted Dorothea with a spare house key, the reality was far less abstract. The soil of F Street would never again yield only roses. The secrets had finally surfaced, grotesquely at odds with the soft voice and gentle manners that had once made Dorothea Puente the neighborhood's patron saint. The terror lay as much in her ordinary disguise as in the extraordinary evil she harbored beneath the concrete. The flight and fall, Dorothea Puente's brief escape. As the grisly scene unfolded in the yard at 1426 F Street, a different kind of drama played out behind the closed doors of Dorothea Puente's now infamous Victorian boarding house. While officers and forensic teams unearthed body after body beneath the garden and cement, Dorothea herself turned in a performance worthy of her legendary duplicity, a breathtaking display of fragile innocence mixed with meticulous calculation. She greeted every query with the same soft resignation, serving tea to investigators, answering questions in her tired, grandmotherly voice, and even offering condolences for the poor souls whose fate she claimed not to know. It was a chilling display of composure. Her voice never cracked, her hands never trembled, and her gaze barely flickered, even as news crews began setting up outside her picket fence and plainclothes detectives drifted through her parlor. She was, to the last moment, the perfect mask for the predator within. But beneath that practiced calm, Dorothea's mind was racing. The net was tightening. Each shovel of dirt from her garden was another crack in the armor she had spent years constructing, and Dorothea knew instinctively that the walls were closing in fast. It was perhaps inevitable that she would run. She had lived her entire life on the edge of society, always planning an exit, always seeing 3 moves ahead. Detectives, preoccupied with the mounting horror in the backyard, found themselves outmaneuvered, if only temporarily, by the wits of a woman who had survived for decades by blending into the background. When she politely asked to leave the house, under the pretense of getting coffee at a nearby hotel, investigators, accustomed to her frail appearance and subdued demeanor, hesitated. After a brief discussion, they agreed. What threat could the little old lady possibly pose? By the time anyone realized she was gone, Dorothea was already slipping away into the city's underbelly, vanishing like a shadow at dusk. She had cash stashed away for just such an emergency, enough for a cheap motel, a few meals, and, she hoped, a bus ticket out of Sacramento. In her room she avoided windows and made only brief forays into the lobby or nearby diners. For 2 days police scoured the city, releasing her photo to every television and newspaper in California. It was a race against time, authorities anxious that she might flee the state, Dorothea counting on her knack for disappearing into crowds. While the headlines screamed her name, Dorothea did what she'd always done best. She performed. At the rundown hotel, she introduced herself to the night clerk as Donna Johansson, a harmless grandmother visiting from Los Angeles whose purse had just been stolen. She wore oversized sunglasses, a faded floral scarf, and toted an old canvas purse. Her disguise simple but effective, draping herself in just enough anonymity to draw little attention. She spent her days reading newspapers in the hotel lobby and eavesdropping on the gossip that now swirled around the city. If anyone gave her so much as a second glance, she'd beam that familiar practiced smile, politely deflecting all but the most determined curiosity. Occasionally she even managed to charm travelers passing through, offering gentle advice, asking about their children, and in one chilling moment, gently patting the arm of a young couple discussing how that awful business on F Street must have been the work of some desperate, faceless monster. Inside, Dorothea's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. If anyone suspected she was the deathly grandmother whose mugshot now adorned every television and newspaper stand, they gave no sign. But Sacramento was no longer the anonymous sprawl she once knew. Word of the F Street murders spread rapidly. There were radio announcements, nightly news updates, and police combing local shelters, hospitals, and transit stations. Tips poured in from people convinced they'd seen Dorothea in bus stations, grocery stores, or even bizarrely, at a bingo parlor in the next county. For police, each false sighting only stoked the urgency. In press conferences, interrogators emphasized the need for public vigilance and described Puente as cunning and dangerous, despite her age and grandmotherly appearance. As the manhunt intensified, Dorothea's sense of isolation deepened. She barely slept, haunted by memories of each tenant, the weight of every secret pressed into every brick of that old Victorian house. Yet fear was a familiar companion, and she still believed she could outsmart the world. She scouted her potential escape routes as methodically as she had once scouted her victims, consulting bus schedules, plotting which stations were least likely to be patrolled, and practicing new signatures in case she needed to sign for a room or a check. The tension reached a critical point on the 3rd day of her flight. That morning Dorothea overheard a pair of hotel guests debating whether the F Street suspect could be hiding out nearby. Her heart skipped, but her outward expression remained a mask of bland concern. She realized she couldn't wait much longer. Alone in her dingy room, Dorothea counted her remaining cash, repacked her meager belongings, and steeled herself for a final move. She resolved to head south toward Los Angeles, where it might be easier to vanish among the city's sprawling neighborhoods and transient populations. Before leaving, she made one last stop, a crowded bar that catered to down-and-outs and drifters. Dorothea figured it was the perfect place to blend in, to maybe hitch a ride or glean information about a safe route down the coast. She nursed a soda at the sticky bar, watching the throng with weary, predatory patience. If she could just keep one step ahead of the police and the media, freedom might still be within her grasp. But as fate would have it, Dorothea's mastery of disguise finally met its match. Not through the vigilance of police detectives, but thanks to the keen observation of another lost soul. A local man watching the news on the bar's old TV suddenly squinted at the woman sipping quietly at the corner. Something about her mannerisms, a flash of her smile, the cautious way she cradled her drink, set alarms ringing in his mind. He excused himself, made a call from the payphone out back, and within an hour Sacramento PD dispatched officers to the location. Dorothea's capture was anticlimactic in its calmness. She didn't resist. She merely looked at the officers, her shoulders sagging, and sighed as if all the weight of her never-ending performances had finally crashed down. To the handful of patrons who witnessed her arrest, she seemed nothing like the monster portrayed on the nightly news. Some expressed disbelief, others morbid curiosity. How could this small, polite old woman possibly be a serial killer? Back in custody, Dorothea tried to resurrect her facade of innocence. She offered polite denials, insisted that she was framed, and when pressed about her flight claimed she had left out of fear, not guilt. But the evidence was now overwhelming. Police had unearthed 7 bodies from her backyard, hundreds of documents tying her to benefits fraud, and a tangle of forged signatures and vanished tenants whose only common thread was a stay at her house. The news of her arrest lit up every local and national headline. Sacramento's relief mingled with horror. Families of missing loved ones called police in the hundreds, desperate to learn if their relatives were among the bodies discovered. Reporters mobbed the courthouse steps as Dorothea was led inside in handcuffs, her once prim exterior now overshadowed by the knowledge of what lay beneath it. Interviews with neighbors and former tenants flooded the airwaves. Some still found themselves doubting she could be capable of such evil, while others recalled unease that, in hindsight, had always been present but never spoken aloud. Law enforcement officials recounted the bizarre calm with which Puente had attempted to manipulate the scene, even as the horrors were being revealed. Officers later reported her uncanny skill for shifting blame or weaving new fictions, at times genuinely uncertain whether she truly believed her own lies. For the detectives who first searched the house and allowed her briefly to slip free, there was embarrassment and genuine frustration. "She fooled all of us, until she couldn't," one officer told the press. After her capture, Dorothea's trial preparations began, an epic legal and forensic undertaking complicated by the confusion of false identities, overlapping records, and the slow, heartbreaking process of identifying the victims. The scale of her fraud, as well as the human cost, gradually emerged in full: stolen Social Security and disability checks, personal effects sold in pawn shops, stories rehearsed for years to explain each missing person who had last been seen at her address. Surviving residents and former employees were called to testify. Some flinched at recalling the subtle, insidious ways Dorothea exerted control, through kindness and threat in equal measure. Yet, even as she faced a mountain of evidence, the final image of Dorothea Puente's escape and recapture remained curiously unresolved for many. Was she a master criminal, or a tragic, damaged figure acting out of desperate self-preservation? Either way, her fleeting flight through Sacramento embodied one last, desperate attempt at the same illusion that had protected her for decades: the hope that, with enough cleverness, she could slip the noose of justice and vanish into legend. Instead, history would remember her for what she left behind, not merely bodies hidden beneath concrete, but the shattering of a whole community's faith in appearances, and a chilling reminder of the evil that sometimes hides in plain sight. The unemotional trial. The courtroom was cold and sterile, its walls bearing the weight of both justice and spectacle. When Dorothea Puente entered, she cut an unexpectedly diminutive figure, small, elderly, wrapped in a faded cardigan as if to shield herself from the world's judgment. The media frenzy outside contrasted sharply with Dorothea's blank, unfazed stare. The so-called death house on F Street had finally spilled its secrets, and Sacramento craved answers. But the woman at the center showed no outward sign of remorse. Her face remained impassive as she took her seat across from the jury that would decide her fate. The prosecution began its case with a chilling and methodical recitation of events. Each body unearthed from beneath the concrete told a story of betrayal and cold calculation. Autopsy reports revealed evidence of drugging, suffocation, and, most hauntingly, the deliberate targeting of society's most vulnerable. Assistant District Attorney John O'Mara's voice alternated between clinical detachment and barely restrained outrage. He painted Dorothea as a master manipulator, a woman who adopted a grandmotherly mask to facilitate premeditated murder for profit. Diagrams, crime scene photographs, and meticulously documented financial records all supported a narrative almost too monstrous to believe. Witness after witness took the stand. Former residents who'd survived, social workers haunted by hindsight, law enforcement officers recalling their growing dread as they uncovered the bodies. There were moments when the courtroom felt suffocating with shared guilt. How had so many missed the warning signs? One nurse, voice trembling, recalled how Puente seemed almost saintly, always offering to manage medication and handle bank trips for her frail tenants. Yet none of the witnesses reporting suspicions had solid evidence until it was far too late. The defense seized on this thick fog of doubt, hoping to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline and introduce uncertainty. The defense, led by attorney Kevin Clancy, constructed an alternative portrait of Dorothea. Their argument hinged on her traumatic background, a childhood of abuse, abandonment, and system failure so severe it seemed to preordain her alienation from society. Throughout the trial, Clancy asked jurors to ponder the true difference between willful cunning and pathological coping. He cited medical evaluations and psychiatric reports suggesting Puente's grasp on reality had long been splintered by mental illness. Schizophrenia, bouts of depression, and emotional trauma all featured centrally in the defense's explanation for her odd affect and apparent coldness in the dock. The heart of the trial, however, lay in the question of motivation. Was Dorothea Puente a greedy serial killer, or a desperate survivor whose good intentions had spiraled out of control? The evidence of fraud was overwhelming. Scores of forged Social Security checks, bank statements bearing her signature, meticulous ledgers in Dorothea's neat handwriting. Yet when it came to murder, the case rested on inferences, traces of sedatives in victims' bodies, the pattern of disappearances, and the forensic testimony about cause of death. Dorothea's own testimony was a chilling study in ambiguity. She spoke quietly, never wavering, and denied any intent to harm her boarders. She claimed she was merely helping, that she had done her best to care for people no one else wanted. When pressed about the bodies under her home, she maintained her innocence, suggesting that they must have died of natural causes or other circumstances she refused to explain. Her detachment was unnerving. Jurors watched, searching for flickers of regret or sorrow, but found only a mask of unfathomable calm. As the trial transitioned from arguments to evidence, the prosecution focused on the financial trail Dorothea left behind. The pattern was stark. Each time a tenant disappeared, Puente continued to cash their government checks, sometimes forging signatures and sending misleading postcards to worried social workers or distant relatives. She kept meticulous records, tracking deaths and benefits with clinical precision. The prosecution hammered home the unlikelihood of such an organized pattern arising purely from coincidence or neglect. One devastating moment for the defense came when the prosecution introduced physical artifacts from the case, tattered clothing belonging to the missing, jewelry pawned and traced back to Dorothea's account, and handwritten letters purportedly from victims that showed signs of forgery. A handwriting analyst detailed how Puente had expertly mimicked the scrawled signatures and peculiar phrasing of her tenants, dazzling the room with samples projected on a screen. The impression was clear. This was not just neglect or mental confusion, but willful, criminal deception. Expert testimony played a pivotal role. A toxicologist described the cocktail of sedatives and antipsychotics discovered in exhumed bodies, noting the levels would have incapacitated or killed even robust individuals, let alone the frail and elderly. A forensic accountant walked the jury through bank statements, highlighting a chilling consistency between Puente's withdrawals and each resident's abrupt vanishing. These details, assembled piece by piece, created an almost unassailable mountain of circumstantial evidence. Yet, through it all, Dorothea Puente's demeanor never changed. She listened to testimony about her manipulation and the despair she inflicted, showing neither flicker of regret nor glimmer of outrage. Her defense attempted to humanize her, calling on a few surviving relatives who described her generosity in earlier years and invoked her hard-luck upbringing. But even their stories felt swallowed by the chilling regularity of her crimes. In closing arguments, O'Mara returned to the families of the victims, children who never saw their parents again, siblings left with only unanswered letters and the terror of not knowing. Each victim, he emphasized, was someone's loved one, not just a pawn in Dorothea's scheme. The courtroom was often overcome by a solemn hush, reporters scribbling furiously as the final narrative was spun for the jury. The defense, in its closing, played to doubt and empathy. Clancy asserted that Dorothea's crimes were rooted in trauma, not malice, that her choices, while abhorrent, were not those of a mastermind. They asked jurors not to let anger override the evidence, especially since the chain of events connecting Dorothea directly to murder was still circumstantial. "In our justice system," he concluded, "we do not convict on suspicion alone." When the jury retired to deliberate, the air in the courtroom was dense with anticipation, a tension that vibrated through every row of benches. For days the jurors pored over photographs, bank ledgers, toxicology charts, and witness transcripts. Conflicting images swirled: the kindly old caretaker, the cunning financial predator, the lost child of California's foster system. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps, speculating on verdicts and relaying each twist to a horrified public glued to every broadcast update. The announcement of a verdict sent ripples through Sacramento. The jury found Dorothea Puente guilty of 3 counts of murder, far fewer than the 9 prosecutors had charged, but enough to secure a life sentence with no possibility of parole. The verdict reflected both the persuasive weight of evidence on some victims and the lingering shadows of doubt on others, a testament to the complexity of the case and the difficulty of untangling truth from a web of lies and circumstantial clues. As sentence was passed, Dorothea absorbed the judge's words without protest. There were no tears, no final, desperate protestations, just the same inscrutable calm. She was led away, leaving behind shattered families, a city forever changed, and an enduring debate over the nature of evil and the limits of justice. The courtroom emptied, but its ghostly hush lingered on, a final echo of the emotionless defendant whose crimes had breached the boundary between care and cruelty in chilling fashion. The final days of the deathly grandmother, Dorothea Puente's last years, drew to a close behind the cold, unyielding walls of Central California Women's Facility. A life finally stripped of the masks she had so carefully crafted. Unlike the bustling Victorian boarding house that once bustled with the fragile hopes and hidden tragedies of Sacramento's forgotten, the prison was a place of ritual monotony, dictated by the rise and fall of institutional bells and the sharp routines of correctional officers. For Dorothea, by then well into her 70s, freedom was a concept she handled only in dreams, where the scents of cinnamon and garden soil flickered on the edge of her sleep. Her arrival at the facility caused a quiet ripple among inmates and staff alike. Some found it impossible to reconcile the slight white-haired woman who quoted recipes and asked about their families, with the infamous deathly grandmother, whose mugshot had burned through every television screen in California. To new inmates, she was a curiosity first, then a mystery. Older convicts whispered cautionary tales about those who mistook kindness for innocence. But, as in her earlier life, Dorothea moved through her final chapter with an inscrutable calm, her true emotional weather always hidden behind a bland, matronly smile. Those first months were a slow unraveling of the privileges she'd manipulated for decades. There was no personal garden to tend, no kitchen to command, and certainly no vulnerable souls from whom to siphon trust or pensions. Her cell was shared with women carrying their own histories of violence, theft, and despair. The prison grapevine carried dark jokes. "Careful, don't let her near your pudding, or she'll ask to manage your commissary." Yet for the most part, Dorothea refrained from the manipulations that once defined her life. Here her old tricks simply didn't work. The institutional environment was far less gullible than the streets of Sacramento, and guards kept a watchful eye on even the most unassuming inmates. To pass the time, Dorothea fell into routines that, oddly, mimicked those at her infamous boarding house. She attended chapel services, though her prayers were silent, eyes never betraying regret nor hope. She wrote lengthy letters to pen pals and aspiring true crime authors, waxing philosophical about fate, justice, and the cruelty of a world that punishes some women for simply trying to survive. Occasionally, she offered cooking advice to those working in the prison kitchen, passing on old family recipes with the same gentle, precise tone that once lulled her tenants into trust. What truly set Dorothea apart from other prisoners was her careful curation of persona. Though she labored with failing joints and lingering illnesses, she never let her guard down among the prison population. She was known to keep her area neat, her letters organized, her small collection of books tightly stacked. When questioned by reporters through the prison press liaisons or officials, she responded with the same detached, almost soothing cadence that had once disarmed Sacramento's social workers. She never admitted guilt, never once referred to the bodies in the garden, the checks in someone else's name, the shadowy past. Her narrative, whether coded in letters or muttered late at night to her cellmate, was always tinted by a conviction in her own victimhood. Before long, word got around of Dorothea's prison legacy project. She'd begun assembling a cookbook, a collection of recipes gathered from inmates and memories of her own past. The project was less an act of redemption and more an effort to outlast the concrete facts of her crimes, to leave behind a story of nourishment instead of neglect. The irony was not lost on those who knew her true history. For many, the idea that the deathly grandmother would be remembered as a chef was the final twist to a story that defied comprehension. Still, age and time took their relentless toll. By her late 70s, Dorothea's health declined rapidly. Her hair, once kept in tight, neat curls for the benefit of parole boards and press photographers, grew thin and colorless. She made fewer public appearances in communal spaces, her gait uncertain, her voice quieter, the infamous wit now little more than a whisper between cell bars. When surrounded by the noise of the rec room, she appeared almost spectral, content to sit with her back to the wall and observe the restless churn of younger inmates. If she missed her former life of deception and control, Dorothea never said so. She maintained her routines even as the world shrank to the confines of her cell, reading crime novels, updating her recipe book, participating in the rare family visitation. Once, a journalist asked through a legal intermediary if she felt remorse, if she ever dreamed of the bodies beneath her garden. Dorothea's answer, relayed secondhand, was as ambiguous as her courtroom testimony. "I did what I could for people no one else wanted, that's more than most can say." Throughout those years, her story continued to fascinate and horrify. Television specials, podcasts, and documentaries replayed the chilling events of F Street, even as Dorothea's memories of her own infamy seemed to dim. Occasionally someone would write seeking her side of the story, and she'd respond in carefully measured prose, refusing to incriminate herself, denying everything and blaming a cold, indifferent system for her fate. The letters served a double purpose. They reinforced the old, unreliable mask and kept her legend alive within and far beyond the prison walls. Some survivors of her crimes tracked her life with grim fascination. Others, especially the families of those buried in her yard, chose to forget. Inside, a handful of prisoners sought out her stories, not for comfort, but for the novelty of proximity to infamy. Dorothea played her part expertly, spinning tales tinged with regret and righteousness, never admitting to the full truth. Even near the very end, she clung to the fragments of her old persona. The past was a burden, but it was also her only claim to meaning. As death approached, life reduced to a pattern of medical visits, brief chapel sessions, and long hours spent staring at the cinder-block ceiling. Her heart, once so adept at calculating every angle of trust and risk, grew sluggish with age and disease. It was a quiet end, marked not by confessions or last-minute revelations, but by the slow fading of someone who had lived so long in the shadowland between care and cruelty. Even the announcement of her passing in 2011 at the age of 82 was understated. A short obituary, a footnote in criminal history, a final line in the thick stack of true crime books that bore her name among America's most chilling figures. Dorothea Puente's last days were not those of the remorseful villain or the tragic anti-hero. They belonged to someone who, to the end, refused to acknowledge the enormity of her actions, choosing instead the comfort of well-worn roles: storyteller, caretaker, misunderstood woman. Her legend endures not for redemption, but for the cold, mundane terror of evil that hides behind teapots and floral curtains, a warning perhaps that the most ordinary faces among us can sometimes harbor the darkest secrets.